Well, welcome back. This time we get to think a little bit about the storyline of the First Testament. And I think that's significant because this term you get to read through the First Testament, book at a time, but each one at one sitting, except for Psalms. And it will not escape your attention that it's 3 times the volume of the New Testament, while it covers a span of time more than 20 times that of the New Testament. So, as you read through the First Testament, I think you'll notice easily that the first 17 books, so Genesis, Exodus, on through Esther, are pretty much in chronological order. But then we come to the book of Job, and from there on, it's not chronological anymore. I tend to think of the last 22 books as overlays on the first 17. So, to help us fit it all together, I'd like to suggest that you undertake your reading project. You think of the First Testament like a grand symphony that unfolds in 5 main movements. Eden, then the election of Abraham, then the Exodus, then the beginning of the empire, and the tragedy of the exiled, followed by an expectant return. So let's look more closely at these movements. The first one, Eden, Genesis 1 through 11. I'm going to argue as we get into Genesis that the first 11 chapters are indeed prologue. We've already touched on a little bit when we've looked at ways that those first 11 chapters are designed intentionally to confront worldview issues, pagan worldview issues, that, if not addressed, really render the rest of the message of the First Testament, and the New Testament for that matter, pretty much meaningless. So, Genesis 1 through 11 starts at the beginning, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, and runs to about the end of the 3rd millennium BC. As you read those opening chapters, of course, the main characters, I think, most people are familiar. Adam and Eve, created as bearers of God's image, commissioned to be fruitful and multiply, to subdue and exercise dominion over creation. And then you remember, Adam and Eve had, among others, Cain, Abel, Seth. Other main characters in that section are going to be Noah and his kids, and particularly Shem, out of those 3. Shem, from which we get the word Semites or Semitic. Issues that take center stage include the nature and the character of God. What's his relationship to creation? We've already talked about that. Is God part of creation, or is he over creation? The reality and destructive impact of evil. The corrupting character and relationships and the separation that results because of sin and evil. Separation from God, separation from family, death, and how God proposes to challenge this dilemma without totally destroying everything. There's a focus already on the promise of God in the promise that God makes to Eve in the aftermath of the fall. Remember? Or if you don't, you'll get to it as you read Genesis 3, that her seed, the seed of the woman, would crush the seed of the enemy, the serpent. An inkling, just an inkling, but an inkling into God's search and rescue mission, the Promise Project. And there's also the focus on the covenant that God makes with Noah, that he won't curse the ground again on account of humans, nor will he again destroy every living thing as he did with the flood. The second movement, election, goes from Genesis 12 then all the way into Exodus chapter 1. We'll talk later about verse divisions and chapter divisions and even book divisions, and recognize that those are a relatively more modern convention. But anyway, back at the ranch, the movement on election, or the selection. Main characters, well, of course, Abraham and Sarah, a childless couple from Ur, 75 years, 65 years old, respectively. They haven't had any kids yet, and it's not getting any more likely. But they're called by God to leave their homeland and their extended family and to come to a land, well, God will show them when they get there. Well, then there's Isaac and his half-brother Ishmael, Jacob and his brother Esau, Jacob's 13 kids, including Joseph, the next to the last. So those are some of the main characters in this movement. And then recognizing that the intention of the human heart is evil from his youth. Back in the prologue, Genesis 8. The issues that take center stage then in this movement include God's search and rescue mission, the Promise Project. Incredibly, God promises this certified childless couple that he's going to make them become a great nation in this land. He's going to bless them, build their reputation so that they will be a blessing. God will protect them. But, and this is important, this is the bottom line of this promise, that through one of their descendants, one of their heirs, all the families of the earth will be blessed. We'll revisit this bottom line of the promise multiple times through the term, because it pops up as we work through these books of the First Testament and in the New Testament as well. Well, the focus here is on the covenant that God makes with Abraham to seal the promise. That's not a separate thing. The covenant was a seal, was a doubling up of the insurance on the promise. I mean, it's as if God's word weren't good enough. But in Genesis 15 and Genesis 17, you get the covenant, and the emphasis there is on the essentiality of faith in God's promise project to provide this seed, this heir, through whom the blessing of salvation will be offered to all the nations of the earth. And so the Bible records that Abraham believed the Lord, and God counted him as righteousness. So get it already in chapter 15. On what grounds was Abraham reckoned to be righteous? On what grounds was Abraham justified? What did the text say? Abraham believed God. It was by faith, not by works. God reckoned Abraham to be righteous by grace through faith. Well, as if being unable to have children for 75 years weren't enough, their faith is tested by 25 more years of patiently and sometimes not so patiently waiting. You'll read in the narrative, now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And then, years later, God asked the unthinkable of Abraham. Relinquish the dream. Give it up. Give it back. Imagine the anguish that Abraham must have felt when he heard God instruct him, Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, the son whom you love. I mean, do you get the pathos in just kind of stringing that out? And go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I'll tell you. Again, you'll know when you get there. It's hard for me to understand how Abe could have gotten up early the next morning and set out on this horrific mission, but, well, we'll be let in on the how later. But he does. And they arrive at the designated place, and you'll read. Isaac says to his dad, looks around, says to his dad, hey, Pops, here's the fire, here's the wood, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abe confidently replies, Isaac, God will see to it. God will provide a lamb for the burnt offering, my son. The New Testament writer of the Epistle to the Hebrews provides an insight into Abraham's heart and mind. He writes about Abram's offering up Isaac. I mean, it's hard to imagine the pain. And the writer of Hebrews asserts that Abraham believed that God was able to raise men even from the dead. You get it? The writer of Hebrews is declaring that Abraham was ready to follow through just because he trusted God. Well, he was convinced God was able to raise men from the dead because essentially that's where Isaac came from. That's how Isaac arrived in the first place. Well, in addition to being an astounding testimony to Abraham's faith, it also provided a metaphor for how God would solve the issue of evil by giving up his son, his only son, the son whom he loved, as a ransom for many. So not only is Jesus the seed of Abraham through whom this blessing of salvation would come to all nations, but by faith in Jesus, when he accomplished on the cross for us, we too belong to the Messiah. We then are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise, Paul teaches in Galatians chapter 3. Well, so we looked at two movements, Eden, election. What's the third movement? Exodus. Begins with Exodus chapter 2 and is going to run through the book of Ruth. So roughly 1527, you can round that off if you want, till around 1050, which would be the beginning then of the monarchy, right? So the main characters in this movement are Moses, Miriam, Aaron, siblings, Joshua. We've got judges in there, but sort of key characters that pop off the page are going to be Moses, Miriam, Aaron, Joshua, and Ruth. Issues that take center stage include the faith-love relationship that God first offers and then asks believers to respond in return. There is a focus on the Passover lamb as well as the Torah, these covenant instructions that God gives by way of Moses to his already covenant people regarding the horror of evil and the cost of grace and forgiveness, and God's righteous expectations regarding how believers ought to live in a covenant relationship with a holy God, and how we ought to worship him as individuals and as a community in the very presence of the God who calls himself Emmanuel. And that's going to be illustrated in tangible ways by means of the tabernacle, but be watching for that name, Emmanuel, or essentially the translation of it, where over and over again, in different settings, God promises, I am with you. I will be with you. Those kinds of promises. So Exodus, the next movement in our little symphony is the Empire. So that begins with Samuel Kings, Chronicles. It includes the prophets. So both what we call the minor prophets and the major prophets are overlays on this particular period of time, which spans from 1050 down to 587, 586 when, well, that's the end of the kingdom. That's when Jerusalem is destroyed. Judah is no more as a kingdom. God had told Abram and Sarah that kings would come from them. Genesis 17. See, God's intent was that his people, Israel, the nation he calls my son, would be a, watch this phrase, a priestly kingdom, a kingdom of priests. That this people, this nation, this covenant community, this faith community would, what does a priest do? Would represent God to the peoples and represent the peoples to God. And so Moses gives instructions about kings and kingdom back in Deuteronomy 17. So it's not unanticipated. We'll talk more about what's going on when they want to have a king like Saul, but hold that till we get there. Main characters in this movement would include, I already mentioned, Saul, to whom the people were attracted. I mean, this guy really stood out. He's going to be a great leader. Why they want a king is they want security. They're looking for security in a permanent warlord like their neighbors had, rather than the ad hoc deliverers that God provided when they turned to him from sin. So really they were looking for sort of a tangible thing they could trust as an alternative to trusting God to be their deliverer. Well, you remember the story, or you'll discover it, that then the Lord chose David. And that's an amazing story. Here's this kid, the least likely choice. But the commentary of the text is, here's a man after God's own heart. And so God establishes a dynasty. And David was succeeded by his son Solomon. So it's Saul, David, Solomon. Solomon's the one who builds the temple in Jerusalem. And in their train, we find transformational leaders with hearts hot for God. Leaders like Asa and Joash and Hezekiah and Josiah, who would model kingdom living for their people and for the watching world. But sadly, the majority of the leaders were, well, maybe they were transformational, but they were transformational in the other direction. So, issues that take center stage in this movement include really a further unfolding of God's search and rescue mission as this grand reclamation and restoration project continues apace. And as the good news is proclaimed in greater detail, the bad news is also all the more apparent. That the human heart is desperate. It's deceitful. And increasing numbers of people who self-identify as followers of Yahweh turn out to be Yahweh followers in name only. The text says they honor God with their lips, but their heart's far from him. Well, after Solomon, the kingdom of Israel splits into two. Israel, the northern kingdom, Judah, the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel has 19 kings over the next 209 years, none of whom did what was right in the sight of the Lord. The northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722. Side by side, the southern kingdom of Judah had 19 kings over the next 345 years, 8 of whom did what was right in the sight of the Lord. And 4 of them, Asa I mentioned, Joash in his 20s, 30s, and 40s, Hezekiah, Josiah in his late teens and early 20s, leaders who were used by the Lord at a very significant strategic time to lead the faith community back to the Lord, to lead, to instigate a work of God's Spirit and revival. Now that's the good news. The bad news is that these revivals tended not to extend into the next generation. But I think that's a point that's being made in these narratives, and we'll come back and revisit that in a bit. Well, in response to what's got to be described as, at worst, as rampant evil, and at best as just pervasive nominality, the southern kingdom of Judah was carried off captive to Babylonia over a couple of decades, from 605 to 586, when ultimately, I mentioned, the capital city of Jerusalem, along with the temple, is destroyed by the Babylonians. And now, there's no more Davidic king, there's no kingdom, and that raises an enormous question. What about this reclamation project, this promise project? It looked to be done in. Well, in this movement, the focus is on kingdom implications of the promise. The project focuses on just an expansion of this covenant with David. 2 Samuel chapter 7, we'll take a closer look at that. The message that God sends to David by way of Nathan is couched in language that reminds David of the promise to Abraham. And David realizes that Nathan's talking about much more than just a career change from, leaving being a shepherd and becoming a king. In good ancient Near Eastern idiom, shepherding a flock of people is what a king does. But we'll see how hearing this in the context of the promise to Abraham blows David away when he realizes that God is talking about this great promise project of reconciling the world to himself. And in response, we'll look at the text. A worshipful David sinks before the Lord and declares, God, you're not talking about just a job. This is the charter of the human race. That God ultimately would seat one of David's descendants on the throne of righteousness forever. And the good news of the kingdom, which is, remember what the gospel writers tell us, was what Jesus went about preaching and teaching. So even in the dark days leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, just the tragedy, the overthrow of the kingdom of Judah, the prophet Jeremiah delivers a message from God that the promise project hadn't been canceled. The exile won't be forever. It'll be more than just, a long weekend. It's going to last for 70 years, Jeremiah says, but the promise is sure. And Jeremiah, along with Isaiah and Ezekiel, declares the everlasting covenant will be renewed. It'll be revitalized. The project of reconciling the world to himself is going to press on for his namesake, in spite of their unfaithfulness. Well, that brings us to the next movement, the exile and return. Ezekiel, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. This stretches from 587 to 430. The discipline of the exile is not forever because God is faithful to his promise. He preserves a righteous remnant through whom the seed of promise, the son of Abraham and David, the righteous king, will come to effect this blessing of salvation for all peoples of every nation, every tribe, every language group. That theme is carried on over into the New Testament as well. Main characters in this movement are going to be Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Ezra, Nehemiah. Issues that take center stage in the narrative and in the preaching include just the futility of nominal religious faith as opposed to the essentiality of a vital, personal, from the heart faith in God and his promise project. The former is vapid. In fact, it's damning. The latter is life-giving, sustaining, eternal. Well, the remnant of God's people return to the land and they live happily ever after, right? Now, you read Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, they still struggle with nominality. But God still persists in calling them to an authentic faith walk with him. Mention the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi proclaim that the ultimate Davidic king is yet to come. God's servant, the branch, the king, righteous and having salvation. He's humble, mounted on a donkey, on a colt, on the foal of a donkey. You watch for those lines when you read in the gospel narratives. This servant is described as the smitten shepherd by Zechariah in chapter 11. So it leaves us with this last movement of expectation. God stops revealing himself through his servants, the prophets. And there's a keen sense of, whoa, this can't be all there is. In 1 Maccabees chapter 9, they talk about great distress in Israel, such as hadn't been seen since the time that the prophets ceased to appear among them. So there was a keen sense that God was not speaking through prophets anymore, but there was also a conviction that the prophet was yet to come. The Davidic king was yet to come. 1 Maccabees 14 talks about the Jews and their priest resolving that Simon should be their leader, their high priest forever, until a trustworthy prophet shall arise, and the faithful are reminded to trust God and follow his instructions. Well, trust God and follow his instructions. That sounds awfully like Deuteronomy. We'll talk about that later. But they're waiting for this ultimate self-revelation of God in the promised one, a second Elijah. Well, what happens when you get to the Gospel of John, and John's going around baptizing, and they wonder, are you the one? Jewish scholars in the pre-Christian era who translated the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, into the Greek Septuagint exposed their messianic expectations, their conviction that the story was not over. For example, in the Septuagint translation of Genesis 49:10, they translated, "A ruler will not fail from Judah, nor a prince from his loins." They were looking for this righteous king. Indeed, in the 1st century A.D., Jewish apocrypha such as 2nd Esdras looks for the fulfilling of the signs that have been foretold. This Messiah that is going to come. And everyone will have been delivered from the evils that had been foretold. So there's this expectation of the coming Messiah. And again, we see that not only in the extra-biblical first century material, but certainly that's clearly played out in the Gospels as well.